real good for the wildlife, right?
Yep.
We
All
will
right.
see.
I think we're recording here. We'll get going. Uh, the beeps are slowing down. All right. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Ryan Forbes, Area Resource Conservationist for Technology over in the Brookings area. And Jess asked me to kind of kick off this Technical Thursday, the last day of March. So hopefully April brings us better weather. So we'll see how tomorrow goes. And I guess it isn't the last day of March. We got one more day, don't we, Pete? So that's how
Yeah.
long this winter. It just can't close the book on this winter.
No.
Well, this morning we have Pete Bauman, and he's a field specialist for SDSU Extension. And I know many of you have probably heard Pete talk over the years and through tours, and he's probably sent you a lot of different types of emails. And I tried to get a bio on him this morning. I'm kind of disappointed in your bio, Pete. I'm just going to read this word for word. Let's see here. Where is it? Pete supports the citizens of South Dakota in his roles as SDSU Extension Range Field Specialist in Watertown. I know you're a lot more than that, Pete. I think you could do a little bit better job on your bio on the site. So, but
they
anyways,
wouldn't allow me to print the one that I wanted to write. So
right. So, anyways, this morning Pete is going to visit with us about some of the research that he's been doing north of Watertown. It's called the South Shore SDSU Extension Site, and it's in a relationship to cover crops and grass seedings and different type of seed prep in that. So lots of good information that he has available, what he's done. And this project's been going on for about 3 years, Pete, is that right?
actually, we're actually in our fifth year already.
Fifth
Time
year.
flies. Yeah.
Yeah, time flies when you're having fun. But if we have a lot of external people on the call this morning, so if you could shut your cameras off and make sure that you're on mute, so we got plenty of bandwidth, and that would be great. And Pete, I'll let you have the floor, and I'll monitor questions throughout the meeting here this morning. So if there's a question, do you just want me to say that, interrupt you, Pete, or you want me to save them till the end, or how would you like to do that?
I think make the call. I'll try to kind of pause between, so there's a little bit of opportunity for you to jump in with questions. But if they're relevant, let's do this. If they're relevant to the slide that's up or something, let's tackle it in real time, because on a webinar it's really hard to go backwards, right?
Yep.
So let's tackle that, and then we can decide whether we'll go deep into that question at the time or table it till the end. So just kind of use your best judgment, Ryan. I'm fine with that.
Sounds good.
Yeah, and so I just to get started here, thank you all for joining. I want to preface this a little bit before I even get into the talk, that this is not a me only project by any means. There's a lot of people that have worked together on the questions, the opportunities that I'm going to present here today. And there's a lot of people that deserve credit. There's also a lot of remaining questions. And so this Tech Thursday, I know that that NRCS is intending these to be learning opportunities. And I think that's really what we've got for you today. It's like manager science. It's not hardcore research. So if you're a producer out there listening, I think there's going to be something in this for everyone. And even where I do present the data, I try to do so in a way that's really understandable, really trying to focus on the take homes, not trying to, wow you with statistics or anything like that, because we really don't have that many anyway. So I'm going to share my screen here, Brian, and tell me if this is going to work.
Yep, looking for it still.
How does that look to you? You've got
up and
that?
Rolling. Yep.
Okay. So do cover crops enhance success of prairie plantings? Cautionary tale. The background here was I went to NRCS several years ago, I think back in 2017, kind of brainstormed with Jeff Vanderwill a little bit about, could we throw a little bit of money at some, questions that we had, like, this idea of cover crops, and how do cover crops potentially have a role in grassland restoration in the future. The reason I thought this important to do this webinar was that I will say that I've heard some rumblings in the field that have, I think, advanced. I think the optimism has gone further than than the reality. And so what I wanted to is kind of present the reality and see if our optimism for cover crops is warranted or not. So that's where we're going with this. I got to make sure my slides are advancing here. So 1 second.
We see the first, yep, there it is, Pete.
Okay, so just a bit of background. This graph is courtesy of Mark Norton with Game Fish and Parks. I asked Mark just to give us some trend lines of CRP in South Dakota over the last 20 some years or so. And as you can see, the trend line still declines a little bit. We'll see what 2023 and 2024 bring. But what's interesting about that is you see the red line about 2008, and this is somewhat subjective. But after talking with colleagues and stuff, I think we're pretty much on the mark here. Is that before 2008, the bulk of CRP plantings were, you could basically say, were low diversity. Going back to the 80s, it was like brome and sweet clover. We've gotten a long way through that through the early 2000s. But really, since about the 2008, or since the last 15 years, is when we really started hitting these higher diversity mixes. So even though the acres of CRP are not like they were in the heyday, the diversity of the CRP is generally better. And I am going to speak to this entire presentation more or less by way of USDA program and program influence and program impacts. I mean, there's other restorations out there. And some of those will be examples, but we kind of try to keep this hitting home for those that are on the call, as relevance for helping the common landowner on common land. And the common approach to establishment, generally speaking, still is, we more or less following soybeans, Roundup Ready soybeans, etc. Usually a little bit of tillage is involved in our private land restorations through USDA programs, and typically they're drilled. Now there's caveats to all that. We can broadcast, we can do a no-till, etc. But more or less, this still represents the bulk of the approach. One thing so even though we've had a positive, a negative decline, you might say, in acres, an increase in diversity, there seems to be a perception of an increase over time in CRP failures, or generally speaking, people being frustrated with their results. Now, I don't know if that's true or not. There's really no way to quantify that. It just seems like that there's more buzz about failed plantings today than there used to be in the past. Maybe that's because more people are talking. Maybe it's because technology allows us to share those kind of failures maybe a little more readily. I don't really know, but it seems like that's true. I'm not sure what the group thinks about that. I think that'd be an interesting point of conversation at the end, Ryan, to bring that question back up. But in response to that, you got to start asking questions. So why? Is it cropping history? Is it poor methodologies? Is it, I don't even have on here, but lack of experience for those that are installing these plantings? Chemical carryover might be an issue, site preparation, etc. So what's the driver? What are the drivers behind success or failure in these plantings? So we've got a really strong team of folks up here in the Northeast, and I'm very fortunate to be part of that group, and it includes staff from Game Fish and Parks, Fish and Wildlife Service, Ducks Unlimited, Pheasants Forever, Nature Conservancy, SDSU, NRCS, and private individuals, and the list goes on. You can see across the bottom of my slides acknowledgement of the partners in these restoration processes. I know there's always a chance you're going to forget someone, and I see I don't have Ducks Unlimited emblem on there, which is my mistake. But if I missed others, I apologize. But you know who you are, and it's a great working team. We're working together in fire. We're working together in restoration. We're working together in grazing, education. So the question was, can this same group of people, help assess failures or test assumptions? The questions that we kind of posed were, first of all, the objectives of looking at this cover cropping in grassland restoration. One was kind of to test the USDA guidelines. is there a way to help private landowners bridge the gap between cropping and enrolling into a full-on grassland project like CRP or others, even EQIP, falls into this question. Can we reduce that impact of this agricultural chemical carryover, which seems to be getting worse as far as the concoction that are being used out on the land? It's really hard to get a handle on that. And could we improve the soil health? We obviously we all know the tenets of soil health. I'm going to just make that grand assumption. I'm not going to go into all that, but a living root in the soil, diversity. Logically, there seems to be an objective there that makes sense. Adding organic matter, etc. And then we had an education and outreach objective, which is what we're doing here today. Now, the hypothesis here was pretty simple. Could we use 1 or 2 years of inexpensive common cover crop mixes prior to putting in these native plants that would serve not only the soil health benefits that we talked about on the left-hand side, but could they potentially serve as a surrogate to the needs of native plants? If the soil biology is off kilter and we put in expensive native plants, are we asking those plants to play a role that we could more easily accomplish with cheaper alternative plant life on the beginning? Now that's a very rudimentary hypothesis because I'm not a soil scientist and I'm not a root ecologist and I'm not all those other things, and neither is anybody on our team. But logically, these are the questions that were being asked, and we're like, try it. Why not? So we weren't just jumping on the cover crop bandwagon, you might say. And if we tend to do these things in ecology, I mean, if you're struggling with any illness, use cover crops. I mean, it's like the solution to everything, right? So we were trying to avoid that and asking ourselves some really strong questions. And one of the approaches, or the approach we wanted to use, was common tillage, common planting, and common management techniques that would be available to landowners. So that was the premise of these questions. Ryan, I'm going to pause. Is there any immediate questions right now?
There's one in here. My experience planting as early in the spring to catch timely and frequent rainfall is very important. It outweighs NRCS recommendations regarding soil temps, and it's just on less.
Okay.
That's probably a later question.
I think so.
Pete.
That's an end of webinar discussion point.
Yep. So we'll come back to that one. There's some more to it, but yep, go ahead.
You just let's do this then. Let's just have you jump in when and if necessary. Just jump in and let me know. Okay. So there's five projects that are really tied together in this larger group, and they all have involved cover crops at some point over the last 5 years as a part of the restoration process. Today, we're going to focus only on the Northeast Research Farm at SDSU, and this is part one, what we've called part one of the webinar. We actually are making this a 2-part series now. So just on the outset here, I want to let you know that on May 4th, we'll do the follow-up webinar on the other 4 projects. They have there's just less backgrounding, less data available for those, so I can lump them all into one much easier, leaving a lot of room for discussion today. And I think it'll be kind of cool to leave today, have that discussion, leave today, and then revisit this in a month with these other projects. So just wanted to get that on your calendars. Like I said, today we're talking about the Northeast Research Farm at SDSU. Ryan did a nice job introducing that, up near north of Watertown, near South Shore. So what we did is develop non-replicated learning plots. We just didn't have that much space, time, or money to do much more than that. So these are kind of one-off trials developed by our team, including with large influence from Ryan Forbes, who's our host today, and Jay Herman, who I believe is probably out there somewhere in the call. So the background quickly on that site was it was previously managed as a typical corn soybean rotation. Um, there is some plots that were wheat. I'll show you that here in a little bit. Prior to our implementation of our study or our trials, we wanted to test till versus no till. We wanted to test cover crops as a seed bed prep. I've already outlined that. We wanted to test burning during that establishment period. That's always a debate within USDA rules is, how long is the establishment period and what flexibility do we have during establishment? While we're building the house, is that 2 years? Is that 3 years? Should it be 5 years? Can you justify it? Is it wiggle room? So that's a pending question. The timing and frequency of mowing. And then we wanted to test those USDA standards against flexible management, the things that we tend to teach, burning, for instance, for the first 5 years for establishment, whether we're burning or mowing within or outside of the primary nesting season. And then, what are the other future uses of that site? We want to just kind of push back on some of the standards and see if maybe we can't help collective learning, among all the groups, including USDA. So this is what the site looked like. Small site, about 6 acres or so. What's shown in green is a subset of plots that were established on wheat stubble. The lay of the land in the fall of 2017 is coming out of soybeans, so typical soybean stubble, and coming out of wheat trials, so fairly typical wheat stubble. I'm going to tackle the big question right now about the history and chemical history. Unfortunately, you would think on a research farm there would be really good records of that, but because it's a research farm and because plots get broken up and things, it is extremely difficult to piece together the actual chemical history under any given plot. Okay, so part of the philosophy here is, as I've done a little bit more work in this, I've realized even on private land, it's not as easy to stitch together the chemical history as you might think it is. So one of the philosophies of this whole idea is that if you don't know, or if you think you don't know, does a year of cover cropping as an interim just hedge your bets against success for the future? If you don't know your chemical history, let the cover crops do the work during that half-life breakdown or that volatilization or that chemical breakdown in the soil versus native plants. So anyway, so starting off with the spring of 2018, the sites that are more gray, were tilled prior to any implementation of our planting. The sites that are green now, the plots that are green, overlaid on the tilled and no tilled, is where we put in what we call the CP37 grassland mix. A typical CRP mix was drilled into those plots in the spring of 2018. Just a shot of the mix itself. What that mix consisted of, I'm certain you can't probably read all of these, but a dozen native forbs and 8 grass species, typical off-the-shelf mix, proven to be pretty successful in general in grass plantings. What you see now in the green or yellow shaded is where we initiated cover crops that first year of 2018. Those were our cover crop trial plots. So they got just straight cover crops, not mixed with native seed. It's just a full season cover crop mix. 11 species, including clovers, millet, safflowers, hemp, turnips, oats, kind of a standard mix. And this was developed in part with advice from Jim Capriva out of the Raymond area. Jim is he's a producer that uses cover crops a lot. So Ryan and Jim kind of came up with this mix, and we were like, we got to try something. So we kind of went with a pretty standard, affordable mix. I'm going to walk you through now. I'm not going to try to break down all these plots in detail. It's just too much for everybody will just, it's just too much. I would say if you really want to know details of the history of the plots, check out that video release I did, I think last week, that I linked. Takes about an hour, but I walked through all these plots in real time in the field in 2020. So it gives you a pretty good idea, midsummer growth, what was going on. Here, I'm just going to abbreviate that a little bit. So I'll try to be very clear of what I'm showing you, but if you're unclear, look at the title across the top in bold, and that shows you what you're looking at. So this is a pre-tilled, a CP37 on June 6th of 18. So just a month or so after planting, you can start to see some growth. By the 25th of June, we could roll it out pretty well. By July, we're looking at pretty heavy annual weed infestations. And you see my mower and tractor emblem on there. We did use mowing pretty extensively during the establishment phase of all these plots. By July, again, another mowing. And by September, leaving it alone with a pretty good stand of natives established in year one. I want to visit the mowing a little bit here. I'm just going to kind of put it out there because this is a research farm and because we were kind of the new kid in town. Certainly the weeds that I showed you, the pig weeds, the barnyard grasses, etc., not really all that threatening to a grassland restoration. They look bad, but they're really not all that threatening in most of our collective experience. So you look at the fuel and time and energy to mow. Most of that was done kind of because of aesthetics and because it's a research farm and we didn't want to be a source of weed seed to other neighboring projects. So I just wanted to clarify that a little bit. And mowing, I'm of the school of thought that I will mow a restoration pretty aggressively early on in that first year just to keep the competition down. Now there's debate on all that. Does that provide some shading and some protection to our native plants, or does it just provide more competition that sucks up water that the native planting needs? Debatable, and we can talk about that at the end of the webinar. But at any rate, let's move to the tilled plots. Yeah, that's what I was showing you. So just another example of by September, they were looking pretty good. Now the no-till plots, pretty much the same timeline with the grass establishment, pretty much the same weed pressure, although the no-till might have had slightly more weed pressure, hard to say. But again, use the tools at hand, and by September, we had a pretty good pretty good establishment of our native forbs and grasses. Not completely weed free, but looking pretty good. Okay, now if we move to our cover crop plots where we did not use pre-tillage, excellent stand of covers that first year. The covers we did mow only for the same reason that we were trying to ensure that we weren't going to allow a really heavy seed drop of those annuals. And the reality was these covers were not there for anything other than to serve as that bridge. So we didn't really want or care if the covers went to seed or not. And actually by mowing them and kind of kept them refreshed throughout the entirety of the growing season. You can see here that in July, they're still green and healthy. That was kind of the cover crop year. So our no-till covers looked good. I'm going to just kind of move through this. By September, they're starting to kind of senesce down, but in this picture, you can see oats and crimson clover, some of the brassicas, the Sudan grass, etc. So pretty healthy stand of covers. Now, if we move into our wheat trial areas where we tilled, so it's a wheat stubble that was tilled in the spring and then planted with the CP37 mix. And by September, which I'm showing you here, September that first year, pretty reasonable. I wouldn't say a very good stand, but most of the native plants were present at some point in those plots. With the no-till, it was about the same. You know, these are all visual observations. By September, the cover crop trials on the wheat, again, they weren't nearly as healthy, as they didn't come on as strongly as they did in the soybean stubble. But again, a reasonable stand. Just another shot of the same. Okay. I know that was pretty brief walking through, but like I said, I could kill you with photos over time, but I'm trying to really just emphasize the kind of the results. Now this what you see on screen now is where we, as everybody likes to play around, right? And so we are very guilty of like, hey, let's do this, and then we think of another cool idea and like, hey, let's try this. So we were supposed to do come back and just simply follow through in the spring of 2019 all of those the cover crop trial areas that are outlined in yellow right there. We're supposed to go straight to a CP37 grass mix. 1 year of the test was supposed to be 1 year of covers testing that philosophy, then going into grass. Well, Ryan came back. He's like, hey, I think it was Ryan that did this to me, but hey, let's split this. Let's go straight grass on half of that again, and let's mix grass and cover crop seed together for the other half, so you can see the split. So now the pink is where we had the CP37 and the cover crop mix together, just to see what happens, right? And this is what I want to get to. I want to really emphasize these are one-off, non-replicated. We're basically playing in somebody else's sandbox is the way this is shaping up, but it's pretty cool. So we also decided then to throw in another curveball and like, hey, you know, look at all that heavy cover crop stubble. Let's plant into that, and let's also experiment with burning some of it off and then planting into it. And that's exactly what we did. And in this, at this point, we did start to see some small thistle rosettes in those trials already, pre-establishment, pre-planting of the cover crop. Okay. So I just want to acknowledge that, all right, because that's going to come into play later on here in our assessment. And if you've never burned cover crop stubble, it is like gas. If you've got any experience in native burning, this stuff burns like cordgrass. I was so surprised at the oils and tannins that must still be residual in a cover crop stand in the spring, because it absolutely torched it. So just beware of that. If you're a private landowner and you think that you're going to burn off cover crop stubble, certainly can do it. Just be prepared that it burns hot. Now the results are interesting, because by July of that first year, now we're in the second spring, we burned it off, burned out the stubble, drilled into it with a CP37 and cover crop mix, and it looked dismal in July. The cover crops didn't grow well. The grasses didn't grow well. Nothing grew well other than thistles. And this is year 2. I'm sorry, it's year 2 of the experiment, year 1 of that. So now it's followed up, had cover crops in 2018. Now in 2019, it's got the cover crop and the drilled CP37 mix, and just not looking very good in July across the board. Very weedy, tons of ragweed. We started to see the initiation of a lot of foxtail in this stand, or in these plots, and not much by way of what we desired. I'm going to shift gears now going back to the CP37 plantings, we did use fire also during the establishment phase of those plantings. So throughout 2019 through 2022, we utilized both fire and mowing for those establishments. What you see in front of you now is just an example of the hodgepodge of things that are going on out there. And again, it's really, I'm trying to help you track this, but there's a lot of different management activities on the site. It's kind of shown here by the coding. I'm not going to go through what all that means, but just realize there's fire and mowing happening with these mixes. So over time, where we did not use cover crops on the native plantings as a precursor, they looked pretty good, pretty healthy. This is 2019. Everything's kind of present. You can see there's also, that's purple prairie clover, but you can also see there's a thistle right next to it. The blanket flowers and black-eyed Susans and clovers and stuff were coming pretty well by 2021. Everything still was present in the site. So the management and maintenance seemed pretty decent. By September, you know, it's got a typical kind of grassy stand look to it. But everybody, all the necessary players are there. However, we still did have some invasion of Canada thistle on these sites, as well as perennial sow thistle. Not overly dense, but we're compared to the cover, where we use cover crops, quite a different story. Not looking very good in 2019, as I said. Not very strong native plant community by 2020. Again, all of the players are there, but they're very sparse, very scattered, and heavy weed competition across the board. And by the June of 2021, you can see the thistle pressure. I hope you can see that. It's pretty dense. Here's another shot of thistle pressure in those plots. You can see the yarrow is in there as well. Some black-eyed Susan, etc. But it's very much dominated by thistle. So because this was non-replicated, I applied some pretty good science to my analysis. If you look at my chart here, it goes from everything from pretty good in G to sucks and really sucks in other plots. Now that's pretty scientific assessment, but apparently applying a suck meter to your work is not scientifically valid. So we decided that we better take a harder look at what we really got going on in the field here. I'm sure all of you are laughing right now. So we decided we would just do a team walkthrough, and I'm just showing you the sheet filled out by Owen McElroy with Gamefish Parks at that time. We try to just do a check off of what's present, right? And if you know Owen, he's a pretty good botanist. And so Owen added some other things to his list, and then challenged us, us non-botanists, which is pretty much the rest of our group, and Owen, from on high said we could probably do better and should do better, from his perch in the clouds. So we were like, all right, we can probably do better. I really hope Owen is on. I'm not sure if he is or not, but so we decided to do a little bit of transect plot work and just try to get a better feel of the distribution and density of our plant communities on the site. And that's basically the layout. This was just 1/4 meter frames across each plot in simple transects, looking for both frequency of occurrence and actual stem density of individual species. And then I did another analysis where I went through and I looked simply just for the exotics. And that was just a single transect corner to corner on all plots, just to kind of get a feel for the density of this thistle. Were we really seeing what we thought we were seeing? So now we're going to get into results. Ryan, I'm going to pause again here. Anything pressing questions that I should address?
Well, there's some in here, Pete. Let me see here. There's one question here about seeding. I thought seeding grasses after wheat was discouraged because of the allopathic effects. Do the cover crops suck up allopathic chemicals?
Great question. And that's exactly why we wanted to throw these wheat trials in. Owen McElroy in particular, with some of their work with game fish and parks. And I don't know if Owen is on. I can't see everybody that's on, so maybe during discussion this will come up. But they actually had mixed results over time, and we wanted to take advantage of that. So we wanted to test all these assumptions. We all have heard the allelopathy question, right? And is it true? Is it not true? Do cover crops help suck up that allelopathy? That's a great way to state it. I don't know. So we tested that, but now we're going to get into the results that actually will hopefully shed some light on that. So we can discuss it more, but just stay patient on the results. I'll be getting into that a little bit. Anything else that I should tackle?
Was a plot designated for just covers, parentheses, no grass mix, and then a seeding applied after the covers were terminated?
The covers were not actually terminated. They were allowed to senesce naturally. So that's a key point. I'm glad someone asked that question. So these were season-long covers, never terminated. And so if they dropped any seed on their own after year one, that was allowed. Now they really didn't because we had kept them mowed. But there were some oats that carried over. And so there was if I heard the question correctly, and Ryan restate it if I don't answer it, there was no termination, and they were drilled into that stubble the following spring. Did that answer the question?
Yes.
Okay.
Because I think the question is basically, was it seeding applied after the covers were terminated? So I'm assuming like in season. That's kind of what the question's getting at. Casey asked the question. Yep, she's got a thumbs up there.
Okay.
So then we have one more, Pete, that kind of fits what we're talking about here. I think you missed an important trial, planting covers in early spring and then planting the CRP into green covers, using covers to wake up the soil biology in the spring in weed suppression.
So I think I hear that question. Whoever's asking that, let's table that one for the end of end of the webinar. I think that's a really interesting observation and point that I think we should dig a little deeper into.
Yep, sounds good, Pete.
Okay. So now I'm going to go through a series of slides that are results, and I tried to really make this understandable on a webinar. So I'm using a lot of boxes and stuff so that you can follow along with what I'm trying to highlight. So the first thing that you see now is frequency of occurrence. And when I'm talking about frequency of occurrence, I just want to be clear. What that means is that of the subplots that I set up, did that thing occur? Not how dense was it, not how many stems, just did it occur in that plot? And so the percentage that you're seeing is the percentage of the plots that had that thing in it, not the percentage of the cover of that thing. That's really important to understand. When I say species present, that actually is a physical count. So that helps us understand. One helps us understand the distribution, that's the frequency. The other helps us understand a little bit more about maybe the density or the actual population of that. So I hope that that's clear enough. So moving into that, when we looked at the wheat trials in particular, our trial W3, these are subjective analysis, right? I don't have a lot of statistics. These are one-off, but if I had to pick, I like W3 the best. It's got the best balance of native grasses and native forbs and the least pressure in general of our exotic forbs and our exotic grasses. It also has on par with everything else, specifically with Canada thistle. I also like that plot the most. And again, that was no-till, no cover crop, and the use of fire for establishment. That's again kind of supported by the stem counts as far as the number of native grasses that showed up. 5 of the species that we planted showed up. 5 of the 8 of the native forbs, 7 of the 12 showed up. And we have the least, pretty low pressure or counts of other exotic grasses and forbs. I hope everybody's following that. And again, that's no tilling, no cover cropping, and the use of fire for establishment. Okay, so within the world of the wheat stubble, can we actually establish grass straight up in wheat stubble? It was the question that was just asked, and the answer is, well, yeah, we can. Now, is it as good as the going into soybean stubble? Debatable. We'll see that here in a little bit. But to me, it answers a bit of a question that it's not impossible to do that. Now, if we look at the corn and bean stubble, or the corn, I should say I want to be clear here. We planted into bean stubble, but it was a corn and bean rotation in the past. So, what did we find there? Is that we've got plot F kind of stands out as the leading plot as far as the frequency of occurrence of our native grasses and forbs, which are represented in the blue and the orange bars. Fairly low exotic grass infestation, which is gray, and exotic forbs across the board. They're about as high as everything else. A lot of that, obviously, there's that Canada thistle influence, but overall, that plot is both on frequency of occurrence and an actual stem, counts of those species. 6 of our native grasses showed up, and 9 of the native forbs are present in that plot. And comparatively, fairly low exotic forb and exotic grass stem counts. That again is a plot that was no till, no cover crop, and using burning for establishment. So, can I tell you, is it better than not using burning? I don't know, but this is where we use burning, and this is the one that kind of speaks to me as pretty good. So what I want to point out then is, well, what does it mean as far as, let me see. Okay. So when we kind of break this into different observations, if we look at Canada thistle in particular, now I want you to understand that the way I try to organize this trend data is the better performance is going to always be on your left, and the weaker performance is always going to be on your right. So you'll see trends arrows going up and going down. Always realize that if it's better, the question we're asking is better on the left and worse on the right. So the very best plot in relation to controlling Canada thistle was where we did this milestone trial. I'm going to set that aside for now because I'm going to tackle that a little bit deeper later. So just always know that when you see these graphs, you're going to see this this milestone plot, but kind of ignore it for now because it's an outlier. But in relation to Canada thistle and this perception that we're having trouble with Canada thistle, from left to right, our best plots were represented by no cover cropping, kind of stacked up toward the left, whereas the cover cropping is stacked up toward the right. Now this is trends. This is all I can show you, but the trend is that we had less thistle where we did not use cover crops. We also had less thistle where we tilled. Okay, generally speaking, they were grouped to the left, and where we did not till seemed to have more thistle. That kind of makes sense. I mean, you think of thistle as a perennial plant. Broke that cycle a little bit with tillage. Okay, so wait a second here. I have to go back. Okay, so I did the tillage. I'm sorry, folks. I just got to make sure I don't get ahead of myself here. Okay. If we look at the frequency of occurrence of all exotic grasses and forbs, all the bad nasties, again, There's our trajectory line. Ignore the milestone plot. But it was better where we didn't use cover crops generally than where we did use cover crops. Where we use cover crops tended to have a higher general frequency of occurrence of those exotics. And where they really stacked up was the wheat plots. So where we had on the wheat plots, they all were most all except for W3 is an outlier, but the wheat generally tended to be more infested with the exotics.
Hey, Pete.
Yeah.
So here's a couple good questions about your graphs. What are the main exotic grasses and forbs? So in your labels down there, you rattle those off the top of your head.
Yes. And there'll be, I've got another series of graphs that will help drive that point home that does have them all labeled.
Okay.
So if I could ask for some latitude there, it'll come clear here in a second.
Yep.
But great question.
And then what rate were the cover crops planted again? And I think that was at the very beginning. I think the seeding sheet had the rate per acre, didn't it?
Oh yeah, the if we start getting into rates and stuff,
yeah, we can save that to the end.
Let's save that till the end too, because these are all great questions, but they're really questions that should be discussed openly, because maybe someone's got a real reason for asking about the rates, and I'd like to table that then.
Yep. For now. And this one's a pretty easy one. Was it winter wheat or spring wheat on the wheat trials that it was planted into?
You'd think that would be an easy one to answer, wouldn't
you? maybe it's not.
You know, I want to say spring wheat, but I really honestly don't know, because there was, I should have, okay, so the wheat trials themselves, understand, and that's a great question, whoever asked it, but there was like 40 subplots of wheat of all varieties, all trials, all chemicals in that small wheat block. These were like, I don't know, 15 by 15 foot plots, tons of them. So there's no real consistency in the wheat other than it came out of that whole trial period as wheat stubble. And I mean, I looked at that and I'm like, yeah, I'm going to punt on trying to understand all of those backgrounding factors. And I think we should just remember, so that's truth. So what did we try to do? Well, we said we're going to give it a year with these cover crops to let all that go, let all that, theoretically normalize with the use of a cover in the interim period. So.
Okay. David Karki, he said it was likely spring wheat breeding.
It's so funny because Dave is in the cubicle next to me and he can hear everything I'm saying too. So. Hi, David.
All right. And probably one last one for this segment here, then we'll let you go on here, Pete. Since the seeding is so dependent on time and weather, how can you compare seedings that were not done in the same year for establishment? And that might be one we should save till the end.
That is an excellent question, an excellent point. And understand, I am not claiming to try to do that. What I'm trying to do here is say, after 5 years or 4 years, this is kind of what we're seeing. There's a ton of drivers that we're going to have to try to wrestle with here, but I'm not trying to over present any of this data as gospel truth by any means, because I truly believe that question has a lot of merit. If we didn't plant in the same given year, are we comparing apples to oranges? Probably we are. But there's also another trend here that we're going to see kind of coming, is that as we go through this, it does start to beg the question of, and we're getting there. We're getting there to these questions of like, okay, why are we seeing what we're seeing? So maybe we should just be a little patient, and we'll walk ourselves right to that. Okay.
Sounds good.
All right. So, so as we're going through here, if we're looking at the number of species of exotic forbs, again, they are better on the left, less exotics on the left. And again, we start to see Well, in this example, I saw no really very good trends when I was just looking at the number of species. I couldn't really decipher much here, so I'm gonna just move past that. Not gonna try to pull out more than what the data shows us, and I just don't know. So then let's go to our native plants. Better on the left, worse generally on the right. And what we see is, again, a trend that where we did not use any covers. We had better native plant frequency of occurrence. Where we had covers, less success. Where we did not use tillage, we also stacked up on the better versus tilled. The wheat, again, comparatively to the other plots, the wheat had less frequency of occurrence of our native forbs. So remember, they're all present. They're just much less frequent. And the other caveat is that fire seemed to be, toward the top end of, again, so again, here we got no till, no cover crops, and the use of fire for the frequency of occurrence of those native forbs. Yeah, that's shown there in the green box. The two best plots are F and W3. So moving on to the number of species, the actual counts of those natives, again, we're looking at no-till, no cover, and burning, with the wheat plots toward the other end of having less frequency. The outlier there is at W3, which is kind of in the middle. And again, those are wheat plots. So here's the question. Now we start looking at the actual species. As far as what I would say our very best plot subjectively, was the bean stubble, no tillage, no cover crops, and using spring burning like we've talked about. Oh wait, I'm gonna go back. And there's your as far as your native forb frequency and the native grass frequency across the top, you can see that we had a pretty good representation of all species present. And as far as the exotics on the bottom, exotic grasses and exotic forbs, heavily dominated. The occurrence of exotic forbs was dominated by that lone Canada thistle as a kind of a dominant species in those in that particular plot. Exotic grasses, quack and Kentucky bluegrass, and a little bit of wheat was in there, but not much for the yellow foxtail or the green foxtail or anything like that. So I'm going to move off of that slide and show you. And so overall, subjectively, highest native forb and grass, highest forb and grass presence, lowest exotics, but the Canada thistle was up there. This is what that plot looked like from the air, just to kind of give you a visual over time. This is August of 2020. And if I'm a bird or a butterfly or a bee, I'm going to be pretty happy in that plot. So am I showing you anything earth-shattering? No. It's kind of like, well, this is kind of the restoration norm that we typically might use anyway, and it kind of showed us that it's probably arguably the best plot on the place as far as distribution and frequency of those desirables with the least amount of weed pressure. Again, no cover crops. What you're seeing right now, there's a line you can see coming across. I don't know if you can see my cursor. That's where they drilled in a drainage tile, and it was pretty much covered with Canada thistle. That was the only anomaly. So, and I even saw a bird there once. So the site, it is kind of cool because after getting some grass on this site, this is a dick thistle, but we do see a little bit more of an uptick in wildlife and pollinators on these sites, which is kind of cool. No data on that at all, but just a subjective. So our best wheat plot, now again, this W3 wheat plot really was kind of an outlier for all the wheat plots as performing better. Pretty decent distribution of our native forbs as far as frequency, and pretty good representation of our native grasses. Although it's interesting to me that Indian grass and Western wheat just did not show up in these wheat plots at all. And if you look at Big Blue, is very limited. Side oats, the warm seasons are kind of limited. Canada Wild Rye, which is a cool season, switchgrass did okay. I think that's an interesting data set. I don't know what's the driver there, but the question about getting grasses established in wheat, probably there's something going on there. And maybe when we're following up into wheat stubble, we should try to avoid that anyway. Or maybe we are okay with just going with a heavier forb mix. I don't know, but it's an interesting take home for me. As far as our exotic grasses, I got these two flipped. They should be, but the exotic grass on the left now. Sorry about that. But again, actually kind of a low occurrence of the variety of grasses. But the foxtail did not seem to be a big driver in this W3 plot, which in the other wheat plots it was. Quackgrass is pretty prevalent. And then of course we have Canada thistle issues on this one. So that's our best wheat plot. I'm going to move on from that, and I just want to show you what that looks like in real time in August of 2020. That's what this is the flyover of that wheat plot. Okay, I think you get the gist of that. So moving on then to our worst wheat plot, which was W4, just for comparison. Interesting, we did have about half of our native forbs show up. Very low frequency though. And our native grasses were also very dismal. Exotic forbs, Canada thistle occurred in 100% of our subplots, and dandelion was super prevalent. 80% of the plots had dandelion. Our grasses, Japanese brome, quackgrass, etc., was also present. And I think I've got and that was that was the one that we did use cover crops, no tillage, but did use cover crops on. That was our worst wheat plot, and that's what that plot looked like. I think that's just a still video. Yeah, that's not a video. It's just a still photo. Just very, very dismal looking aerially. We did have some sub trials within that one where we so on the right, this is interesting. So on the left was just the 1 year of covers. And you can see that there's a few native plants. I think what we're looking at probably is black-eyed Susan, some yarrow scattered in there. You can see that. But where we went back and did the cover and CP37 mix the second year as a follow-up, there's like no occurrence hardly of our native forbs whatsoever. So I think that's pretty interesting, how hard of a line that is. And this is what that plot looks like on the ground, dominated by a dandelion in the spring. And we even tried to burn late to try to knock some of that dandelion out, which might have had some moderate success, but very much dominated by dandelions. Okay, so I'm going to pose these questions. We're not going to answer them right now, but these are going to come up on screen at the end here. Is why are we seeing failure in the cover crops? Did we choose the wrong species? Did we have contaminated seed? Or was it the processes that we were employing within the idea of using cover crops that were actually the culprit more so than the cover crops themselves? So we're gonna table those questions for now, and that'll be part of our discussion driver at the end. I want to show you now this particular plot where we did some milestone application on plot C, where we were having arguably some of the heaviest thistle infestation. Brett Blank and Owen McElroy did this for us, Game Fish and Parks. And basically the untreated side on the left, in the fall, it was treated in the fall of 2020 with 5 ounces, typical rate that GF&P would use on a grassland establishment. On the left is untreated. You can see there's diversity there, but there's also a lot of thistle in that Canada wild rye. And on the right, a year later, there's no diversity other than Canada wild rye and a few scattered thistles. So again, where it was unsprayed is full of thistle, but also a little bit more variety, as you can see here, some grasses. Where it was sprayed, like absolutely benign, just grass and exotics. Only quack and dandelion seem to really persist in that stand. And there's the fall of 2022 on the untreated side, which actually did get mowed off. That's why it's shorter, because there is still a plethora of Canada thistle, but there's also remnants of our native forbs. Whereas on the right, we've got just a dominant stand of Canada wild rye. Still thistle present, creeping, had crept back in. A little bit of natives, but not a very diverse stand by any means. What does that stand look like data-wise? It was our best overall for Canada thistle. It did work. I mean, the milestone took out the Canada thistle, but it was the by far the lowest occurrence of any of our native desirables. So that's something, I think there's a big take-home message there with when we apply these chemicals. The final thing I want to cover then today is these native bulk harvest native plots. So we also took advantage of broadcasting. These plots came in a little bit later, but these are broadcast seeded plots with native bulk harvest seed from the Nature Conservancy's Chippewa Prairie across the border in Minnesota. I'm not going to go into all the details of everything that's in those mixes, but you can see quite a healthy mix of combine harvest and hand harvested seed. This is thanks to Joe Blastic with the Nature Conservancy, and then Game Fish and Parks and Habitat Forever did the seeding for us, did the broadcasting. So the way these plots looked, the objectives were just to kind of test the same things. And could we use bulk harvest native seed in future USDA projects? And did cover crops have a role? And etc. So what we did in the fall of 2019 was broadcast into standing soybeans. And we've done this when I used to be with the Nature Conservancy, did the same. It's a kind of a cool technique. And then you end up getting that soybean stubble after harvest to insulate those seeds, or that's the theory anyway. So that's pretty cool. And then on the other plot that fall was broadcast over we combine harvested it and then broadcast over the top. Okay, that's the background on that one. The other two were broadcast in the spring. One was just a straight up broadcast of the native mix. That was your the BN4. And then the BN3 was cover crop and native mix together, just as some interesting, unique trials. Over time, I'm just going to kind of blast through this because over time, these plots have not performed well at all. There's very little difference that you can see in any of these plots. The covers didn't come on very well at all. Again, this was a broadcast in the fall of, I want to make sure I get this right. It was broadcast in the fall of 19 and the spring of 2020. So again, another different planting season. They're present. The desirable species are present, but at a very low volume. And there's a lot of ragweed and a fair amount of goldenrod. What's interesting though, these are right next to all of our other plots. There's almost no Canada thistle in any of these plots, which I think is just super intriguing. Our establishment of the covers wasn't all that great. And again, the result is quite a bit of goldenrod. Now, there would have been goldenrod in this mix. I will acknowledge that native bulk mix would have had goldenrod in it. Obviously, it's probably the source of the goldenrod. And there's some other natives are showing up, some of the common ones. There's a little bit of verbena, a little bit of cudweed sagewort, and that type of thing, but not great on on the overall mix. And, frankly, I wasn't impressed with the soil of the site here in 2022. It's dry. So I don't know what's going on there, if we've got drought issues or what. Okay, we're wrapping up here. The biggest question then is, do these cover crops have a role mixed in or as a prelude to native plants? And I'm going to throw this up. These are the kind of the questions for discussion at this point. I'll come back to that. Let's see. Oh, no, I think we can go here. I will say that I think we're going to stop there, Ryan, and let's tackle some of these questions and conversation. So let me see if I'm at a place. Let me see if I'm at a place that we should stop sharing, which I think, yeah, that works. So you can see on your screen right now. I'm gonna take my screen off, but our team has come up with a series of questions for future replicated true university style research that would basically test all of, I would say what we did here is pilot work, very much pilot studies. And now it does call for a deeper look. So I'm going to stop sharing, or should I keep sharing and just open it up for questions,
yeah,
Ryan?
That's up to you. You might want to go back with some of these questions and kind of show that screen if we can find it.
Right, that's a good point.
Okay, so quite a few questions came in here, Pete. Let's see, I'll start taking a few of these. A lot of burning questions, Pete. Imagine that.
Yeah. And Ryan, I don't know how you want to do this, but I think this would be a richer discussion if we did allow people to just now at this point unmute, ask the questions, and you can balance it however you want. You can take them from the chat or take them from the floor, but I certainly am not going to say I'm going to have all the answers. So I'd really want to encourage folks that have thoughts, opinions, to jump in on either in the question or answers phase of this. So let's make it a discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. If you want to just raise your hand or just turn your mic on and camera on, or you can leave your camera off, it does not matter, and ask Pete a question, that'd be fine. In the meantime, I'll go through some of these questions here, Pete, for you.
Okay.
I feel burning the cover crops was overdone. The burn would remove weed suppression and change the soil biology towards the surface that the cover crop is intended to accomplish. In future trials using cover crops, or also make sure to leave the cover crops unburned and have a trial with both.
Good question. Good point. And we did. And I know there's a lot to take in there, but there was cover crop trials from year one cover residue that was left unburned. Did not see particularly any difference that I can, I'm saying that a little bit hesitantly, but I don't think we saw any difference whether it was burned or unburned. I don't think we saw any difference anyway. The reason that we burned off the cover crop stubble was just simply to test that theory. Does it matter? Does it hinder, enhance? Lot of heat there. Ryan and I, one of the reasons that we did want to burn it off was that we were starting to see a little bit of thistle rosettes, I believe, didn't we, Ryan? Before we lit those. I know I'm the one that lit them, but could we suppress some of that thistle rosette stage? So this is all experimentation, right? So.
All right. Were the no-till sites, were they treated with glyphosate before planting?
No. No chemical application in any of our work at all. That was I should have probably pointed that out better, but that was one of the tenets that we wanted to pursue is, could we do any of this work? Could we achieve what we wanted to achieve chemical free? Other than that milestone trial.
Okay. Speaking of milestone, was the milestone spot sprayed or more broadly sprayed?
It applied on about half of the plot of that plot C with an ATV sprayer, at a rate of 5 ounces to the acre. And it was applied September 20th of 2020.
So I'd say that'd be more broadly sprayed. He wasn't going out there in the spot spraying then, right? That'd be.
No, it would be a full coverage spray
Yep.
of
Yep.
that particular area. Yep.
Okay. Here's another burning question. So do you think the burning of a new established grasses that don't have good development root system yet is okay or beneficial?
I have been doing this for 20 some years, and my personal preference is if I have to hedge my bets, I'm going to burn every year during the establishment phase of a grassland until I don't need to do it anymore. And that usually is somewhere between 3 and 5 years. Now, caveats, there's always exceptions to the rule, right? There you can, as you time a fire, are you impeding certain plants that you've invested in the planting? Certainly there's cause for conversation in that, but generally speaking, if I'm looking to try to hedge my bets toward the best establishment, I'm going to use spring fire during the establishment phase. Absolutely. Now, what do we see at this site? Can we draw major conclusions from this site depending on one-off? Like I said, these are trials, one-off trials. The big question that rolls around in my mind is, did we somehow enhance thistle establishment or hinder it? But if you look at the sites where we used no tillage, fire during the establishment, and no cover crops, the trend line shows that they perform better. So, and that really does support what I think, if I could speak for the team, generally speaking, that's where we've all come from in restoration philosophy as well. So it kind of supports what we've been doing all along.
All right. Great, Pete. Here's a question about the broadcasting. No packing after the broadcast of the trip prairie seed, question mark?
No packing. And again, our friends at Game Fish and Parks have played around with a lot of things and have really kind of opened my eyes to some of these paradigms. We always talk about hard packed soils and best for grass establishment, whether it's broadcasting or drilling. That may not always have to be true. Okay, now that being said, both are tilled and untilled sites, no packing on either one. Nothing performed very well. That's an anomaly because I would say that by and large, broadcast seeding with native bulk harvest seed on stubble, whether it was tilled or no tilled across the board, Fish and Wildlife Service in Minnesota, GF&P here in South Dakota, Fish and Wildlife in South Dakota, the Nature Conservancy. This is not new. This was absolutely not new. We just wanted to do the trials on this site. And the dismal performance tells me that it has almost nothing to do with the technique or the trial, because this is not new technique or trial, broadcasting these high quality native seeds. And when I say high quality, I mean that there's a background there. These were harvested off of previously burned sites, so the viability in the seed test was excellent. I'm guessing it either had to do with growing conditions or some carryover in the ground as to why we're just not seeing anything. And stick with me on this point, and somebody ask more if you want, but look at the lack of thistle in those plots. Do we have a chemical carryover that's suppressing all perennials? It's a question. I don't have an answer, but it's an interesting result to me. I don't know if those plots will come around or not.
All right. Do you plan to keep monitoring these plots?
Who's asking that question?
Phil Dole or Dahl?
Yeah, you're invited to help me come up and monitor. So, yeah, we're gonna I'm going to try to get another monitoring session in either this growing season or next. I don't think it's worth going out there monitoring it every year, but we'll replicate the monitoring here at some point. You know, we've got the site through 2026, so I'm hoping maybe monitoring in 23 and 24 or 24, and then maybe at the end in 26. So,
All right. This is more of a statement, Pete, than a question. I'm not sure we have enough information to say that there's a case of caution for cover crops. Too many variables, too many different treatment covers, and cover crop mixes to the site history. What we have is a case for exploring more.
I agree, but what I want to, where the cautionary tale comes in is, and I'll be very honest about this. I think the conversation out in the landscape is that, hey, if you let's use covers ahead of, like I want to be clear about what I'm trying to say here. It's just as dangerous for us to promote the use of covers pre-cropping for natives on private land as it is for us to dissuade the use of that. So all I'm trying to say is in a program, and if you've got producers in a program, use some caution. Understand that what we did here with our methodology was we took a full year off and we put in cover crops. And then we went into these grass plantings. I think the tripwire here, and Ben Lardy, I think I would give credit to Ben as being maybe the first one to really kind of synthesize this a little bit, is like, okay, what did we really do? No chemicals, no hindrance to what was in the ground. And did we just incubate a bunch of weeds during that first cover crop year? Being enamored by the idea that we've got this super healthy cover crop stand, how could this possibly go wrong, right? Not realizing that what we're doing is incubating a pretty healthy weed population. You'll see that on part 2 of this, if you rejoin us for the next series, for the next one, on April or May, what did I say? May 4th?
May 4th, I believe, Pete. Yep.
The other projects will be highlighted in that. So this is only one of the 5. That one we're going to tackle what we're seeing at all these other projects, which is really interesting trends that are similar. And so I'm not going to steal the thunder from that, but realize there's a bigger story here. And I guess my caution is that if you're in a USDA service center or private lands office and you're working with private landowners, I suggest you pull back on saying, hey, let's go with covers and because it's going to work. I think you have to say, like, we could try these covers and here's what they found, and we might want to employ some chemical control yet, possibly some, and I hate to have to go back to that, but it may be necessary. I'd like to hear some other voices if anybody's got anything to say.
I've got something to say. As far as like the, not using a cover prior to seeding a native stand, especially in CRP purposes, sometimes, I've been muted.
JC, there you go.
I got muted. Anyway, so we will use covers for 2 purposes. We'll use them to try and, our thoughts. So we were trying to, allow that, a lot of times we run into the pre-emerges on the broadleaves. So authority first is the bad one because it's a 36-month carryover for native species. So try to get that to work itself through the soil profile and then as a form of seed bed prep. So I don't know. I think the idea of saying no, don't do that, and might be a little bit. We need soil cover out there for that 1 year when stuff is laying fallow, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So having at least something out there probably helps. And we have found that even with trees and grass, that actually paying to do the bioassay is probably the most effective.
So let me just address this, and I think this is really important that we're clear about what we are or not saying. So typically USDA tries to make their decisions based on pretty sound science. I will argue that we do not have sound science on cover cropping, and it hurts me to even say this because I was really excited about these trials. Okay, but to your point about mellowing soil and reducing that chemical carryover, absolutely. I think whatever we can get to grow in those transition years is going to help that side of the equation, right? That seems to be very logical. What I want to pull back on is what I'm trying to say is, do the cover crops then also serve as a surrogate for improving the health of the soil biology to the point where our native plants do better? I don't think we have an answer for that. I was hoping that we would like see that in trends. I don't think we saw it in these small studies. I just don't think that, and that's what sucks, I think, for me, is that I really thought that adding organic matter to the soil and adding those covers and adding that living root and letting that living root decay, like logically, it just seemed like it would work. I don't know that we saw that though. Does that make sense, Casey? What I'm trying to say is like a split.
Yeah, I agree with you there, because
Okay.
there's, you're still got a monoculture and the lack of diversity with your, if you're just doing, winter rye or something like that. But no, I agree with you there. It's not a silver bullet and we don't have one yet. And it's a chemical issue moreover than anything for us trying
We think,
to, reestablish cropland.
right. We think these things, and I think that we're probably more right than wrong. But the other thing that I've wrestled with on this is we took a whole bunch of exotic plants, and I think who maybe Eric Megadance maybe brought this up first, and it was kind of a fun conversation. But we took a whole bunch of exotic plants, thinking that they were going to help us establish a whole bunch of native plants. Is really what it comes down to. All these things are exotics. And so the logic behind that, you could actually kind of throw a red flag at just the logic there. Like, are the 12 or 11 exotic plants that we chose to use as a cover crop that we've all become so comfortable with, good at all for establishing a native plant community? You know what I mean? Like, and it's something that needs to be tested. Maybe we just picked the wrong ones. There's hundreds of the plants that probably could have been used. We just picked 11. We might have just got it flat out wrong.
We got a couple of people with their hand raised. Patrick or Dennis, would you like to ask Pete something? Now we're down to Dennis.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Oh,
yeah.
Yep.
Hey guys, so I chimed in earlier about, I think you missed an important part of the trial with doing the cover crop in the same season, planting into that. And the reason I'm saying that is because this years ago when we started looking into this, was many times I'd be out there planting a CRP and the producer missed the boundaries, if you can imagine that, and planted soybeans into where the CRP was going. And every time I planted in the standing soybeans, it was absolutely the best establishment we've ever had. And that's what got us thinking into planting into cover crops, using the cover crops to wake up the biology. Well, it's still growing, not the season before, because I think if you do it the season before, I don't think you have the biology, it goes dormant and you're not getting the effects of it. So that's our thoughts of it, going into this a long time ago.
So Dennis, help me understand what you're trying to say though, because we did the first year of those trials with just the cover crops, like you said, and then we, but half of those trial plots again in the second year got planted the grass mix with the cover crop mix at the same time. So are you suggesting?
That's what I'm saying. You're doing that instead of doing it at the same time. The cover crop should have been planted earlier in the spring and growing before you planted your grass, waking up that biology and get it going, using it as weed suppression as soon as you could, and then planting your grass into it.
So later. Okay, so help me understand one thing though, the lack of growth of the cover crop, regardless. Okay, so now it's mixed with the native seed And I hear you. That would have been a cool trial. We just didn't do it. But I'm just trying to work through what we did do, and the lack of growth of the cover crop in year 2 on a previously cover crop field begs the question: is multi-species season-long cover cropping 2 years in a row, does that work? I mean, I don't even know the answer to that. Like, does anybody know anybody that does cover crop on cover crop with the same mix 2 years in a row? Or did we somehow create a antagonistic environment for all of those things in year 2 by going right back into where we had cover crops the previous year? Is anybody any insight on that at all?
I can't tell you yes or no on that, but I know everybody that does, I mean, season-long cover crops, they plant something else the year after, and doesn't seem to inhibit, that.
Right.
With crops. So I don't know that, but I think planting into something that's growing is something that makes it, like I say, every time I've done it in the soybeans, plant some Roundup Ready soybeans and then plant grass on that, and you'll be amazed what happens.
Can I tell you a thought on that though?
Yeah.
Sometimes what we see is not truth. So I'm not challenging what you're seeing as what you're seeing. I believe everything you're saying. However, think of what happened before that. Those soybeans were probably planted in what was coming out of corn, and depending on the corn concoction that may or may not have been used, corn is a very good harvester of nitrogen. And so you might be planting into standing beans, but what's really the positive effect on the grass planting might be the fact that it was corn the year before more so than it was standing beans today. But I don't know the answer to that. That'd be kind of a cool trial, right?
I can tell you that's not the case, because they don't do the whole CRP. It's just those areas where they will encroach, going in too far. You can see it to the line where they planted them beans.
Oh,
amazing establishment, and the rest of it is not so good.
Okay. So as
Yep.
compared to the rest of the planting, you're saying where the beans are existing,
Yes.
It's just better. Oh, that's interesting. That's super interesting.
Just a thought.
No, I mean, you guys, I mean, this is, I'm not trying to sit here as an authority by any means. I'm just presenting what we found. And that's why I want this discussion, because I think collectively, we all as resource persons have something to contribute to this conversation, because like you said, we did limited trials here, but.
Okay, Trent or Patrick, would you like to ask Pete a question?
Yeah, this is Trent. Say, I saw Patrick's question on the sidebar there, and I'd like Pete's thoughts alongside that.
All right, let me go back to his question. I got to find it now. We're getting a lot of questions here, Pete.
So as you're looking, I know that I promised on part 2 it'll be shorter. On this presentation was the longer of the two. For part 2, we should have much more time for open discussion. I hope if everybody could rejoin us for that in May. I hope that it works for folks. So open invitation there, because I'm intrigued by this entire conversation. I think it's really interesting.
All right, I think this is the question. You think broadcasting into cover crops and highly intensely grazed to terminate, like 3,000 pounds or 300 pounds per acre, 3,000 pounds per acre, 300,000 pounds per acre, would work the seed into the ground and fertilize?
I think it's interesting. I don't know if I can comment on it any more knowledgeably than anybody else, but conceptually, probably. I will say that on our next one, we'll show where I intensively grazed at. This is one of our home, one of the projects I'm going to talk about is something I did at home with a neighbor, where we intensively grazed to terminate the cover crop, and then we seeded into that, broadcasted it the next spring. So I can't say that we actually were able to incorporate the hoof action for the new seed, but it's an interesting trial. I think in that regard, if I was going to play with that that question that Patrick asked, It all is about input costs, and can I do something fun and innovative and do it super cheaply? And we're going to talk about that at the next one. And so I don't have a great answer on that one right now.
Okay. Here's a more of a statement from Jason Miller. North Dakota Plant Material Center did a study a few years ago correctly on brassica species impacting warm season grasses establishment, which surprised Jason. Nancy Jensen is on the call. Maybe she can elaborate. I don't know if Nancy, if you're on the call and if you could speak to that study that Jason's referring to.
We did not do a study with brassica and grass establishment. Well, we did way back, but we didn't do anything specifically on that. We did more a study with establishment based on like seeding rates and things. So I'm not sure what study you're referring to, but we did do a warm season study where we just looked at seeding dates. So I'm not sure which study he's talking about.
Okay. Thank you, Nancy.
I want to remind everyone, we did, just real quickly, Ryan, we do have this outline for this idea of replicated research to tackle this. We're not going to get into that right now. I will bring that back up on session 2 to have that open discussion of what that really looks like. Like, what are the questions we really do need to answer? So I appreciate that, Sandy.
Here's
Nancy. I'm sorry.
This is a good question. I think you'd be a good one to answer this because you run into this a lot, Pete, with the fire stuff, which is that would suggest not burning these tests simply because the average landowner does not have the skills or abilities to apply this practice on a larger scale and the frequency is used in these tests. What would your comment be on that?
I would say that's a fair comment, but I would also say that we could be a whole lot more innovative on CRP and using the tools that are at our disposal for private landowners to be able to burn at that scale. For instance, I won't go on and on here, but in any given CRP planting, we have the ability to manage our edges with fire breaks and fire control. I don't think it's getting talked about nearly enough in the offices. When someone's got a conservation plan that says they're going to use prescribed burning, I don't think our service centers are going far enough on that discussion. I mean, honestly, at this stage of the game with the grass that we're losing, if you're going into CRP and we have to sacrifice 20 feet of edge to gain 150 acres of good stuff, and we make that a bomb-proof edge so these landowners can use fire, I think we need to be a lot more aggressive with that approach, because I agree that if we don't do that, our landowners aren't going to get comfortable with fire at scale to do what I'm suggesting at all. So I'll get off my soapbox there, but
okay. Sounds good. Stan kind of has a comment. I remember when this is Stan talking, he came to South Dakota. Used to joke that East River didn't know what a drought was, but in the last 10 years, it seems frequently in significant drought, East River has increased. I have seen some failures recently due to the drought, and dry years having cover crops there could make the problem worse, basically. So, and that probably leads into that first question that you posed to the group. What are we hearing out in the landscape about failed seedings? Maybe Stan is onto something there too. So.
I agreed. I think Stan's always got great insight and is a good observer of things. And
here's why: is plateau at 2 ounces an acre still being commonly used in seedings?
It's really interesting. I know it's always talked about. I don't know. I will not overspeak on plateau, good or bad. But I do think what we know about the chemistry of any of these things is post-emergent things like plateau do seem to have a role in certain seeding objectives. But there also seems to be emerging at least observation on the hindrance of germination. I look at what that milestone did to the entirety of our forb population out there, and it really intrigues me as to why we saw those results. It wiped them out. Now that's not supposed to happen. And then you get, so I don't know. I think I better not overspeak on plateau or milestone or any of those things. I'd like to hear from someone else if they could answer that question.
Looking through the rest of these questions, Pete, I think we kind of answered most of them.
Hey, Ryan, this is Paul.
Yeah, go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, back when I got towards the end of when I left NRCS back 15 years ago, we started using plateau on almost all our CRP seedings and had tremendous results with it, at a couple ounces an acre. Having recommended now that since I came back, the local elevators are kind of talking them, agronomists are talking them out of using it, looking at the species we're using. And granted, back then, I don't think we were as heavy on the forbs, but it worked wonders when you were doing, warm seeding, warm grass seedings.
Oh yeah.
So I don't know, maybe that's part of it, but I wonder if we should look at maybe trying it at a low rate and see, as long as we can get some germination on our forbs, it might be trying. I tried one last year, talk them into it, and we ended up with a large, it was just a beautiful seeding of pigeon grass that we could have prevented all that from coming in.
Well, and I'm going to try. I don't know if Game Fish and Park staff are on today. We have so many people on, 100 and some people. So I'm going to try to see if I can't get Owen McElroy and Brett Blank to participate in the part 2, because there is a little bit more experience with plateau and on those chemicals there. I think what I want to impress upon folks though is that why are we doing any of this? And the reality is, out there in the landscape, we are trying to help suppress the battle between establishment of diverse native cover and pollinators and all these good things that we're after, against the pressure from county weed boards and neighbors to tolerate weedy species. And in the wake of that, we keep coming back to this debate over, do I kill my thistles with something aggressive, or do I kill this or that with something aggressive and wipe out my forbs? So this was like a step one to try to say, is there a different way to do this? Is there a different way to approach the long haul? Because what do we truly want from these plantings? We want them to be ultimately something desirable on year 15 that stays on the landscape, that doesn't just get replowed back up, right? Like, that's kind of the big picture here. So, and we want them to be diverse, and we want them to function well. And I think if we can keep our eye on that prize, all of these other questions start to funnel toward why are we trying these different things? Part of this was, can we do something chemical free? Can we simply acknowledge that less chemicals is better? We might have found some answers toward that. We might not have, depending on which plots we look at, which truly calls for, like I said, this is pilot level stuff. And we probably need to push for replicated research to really get at the heart of these questions.
Let's see here, running out of questions. There was one way at the very beginning. This might be one more I can address, Pete, here, but they're speaking to planting as early in the spring as possible to catch a timely, frequent rainfall is very important. It outweighs NRCS recommendations regarding soil temps. And I got to scroll down here. Unless the planting dates, from at least when I remember, are so late in the spring, or generally miss the period when was the chance of getting rains every 4 to 7 days. So I guess from our seeding perspective and our seeding recommendations out of our technical notes, it's good. It's the best time to get cool season and warm season grasses in early spring, prior to May 15th for sure. Of course, every year May 15th looks a lot different, right? So May 15th is not always May 15th. And speaking of the temperature, that would probably be more with dormant seedings. would be the best thing there. Making sure they're not trying to germinate and that type of deal would be the deal.
Right. And Ryan, I think for the benefit of the group, Ryan and I and Jay, and the three of us, and actually Owen McElroy too, because we were planting on the GF&P stuff that I didn't present today, but collectively, I didn't know when to plant covers. I mean, I was just like, I don't know what, when you're looking for a season long cover, I mean, they're radishes and they're oats and they're going to do well in the cool of the year. But we also had warm season species in there like the hemp and the sorghum Sudan and things. And so again, this is a hodgepodge mix of covers. And one of the, I think, collective thoughts was in both planting seasons, 2018 and 2019, it was cold and wet in the spring. And we had to kind of wait to get plantable conditions. I mean, even to be able to run across the ground. So were they late? Maybe. It certainly could have been a factor in some of this, Ryan, do you have anything to add to that? I mean, you were out there.
Yeah, it's every year is so different, Pete. May 15th is not always May 15th, and the person just has to do the best that they can. From my perspective, in the spring, the sooner you get the stuff in the ground, the better off you're going to be. There's no doubt about that. So, I guess that's where I just would leave that, Pete. There's one question that popped up. What do you think of the fall grazing the CP37 after grazing a cover crop following oats?
Fall grazing the cover crop or grazing the grass?
What do you think? So what do you think of fall seeding of a CP37 after grazing the cover crop following oats? I'm sorry, Pete.
I think we talked about that a little bit here just before, didn't we? Like, I don't know. I mean, hoof action, pressure and hoof action, all that, there's some reasonable logic to that idea. I think if it's drilled, there's really no reason you couldn't do that. I just have no idea what we're really, what the cover crop is actually. So here's my thought, that if you take what we did and we said we had a year of cover crops, and if you replicated our methodology where it's just saying we're going to plant the cover crops, we're going to give them a full season of growth, we're not going to use chemicals, and we're not going to terminate them, and then you plant it into that with a CP37 mix in the fall, I don't see logically why you're going to have a whole much different results than if you're going into that now dormant cover crop residual the following spring with the same seed, with the same CP37 mix. In both cases, you're very similar. Now, is there an argument that the CP37 would do better overwintering out there in the ground and, and being there immediately in the spring? Maybe. It's an interesting question, but I think that you don't get away from some of the burning questions that we just came up with is, did that cover crop incubate a weed population that's going to express itself the following year, regardless of when you put that CP37 in the ground? I hope I'm clear on that answer. It's like two different things are going on at the same time. One is, does the cover crop help the native plants at all? The second is, does the cover crop, in a sense, did we change the dynamic because we allowed a weed population to persist that we didn't know about? And I don't know the answer.
All right. Patrick, do you have a question for Pete that you want to ask him?
Yeah. So when I was consulting out in Rapid, I worked with a producer out in Montana, And they were converting all their wheat crop, and they called, I don't know if it's an official term or where they found up or if they just made it up, but they called it phase planting, phase seeding is what they called it. So essentially they would take their wheat, they'd harvest that wheat, put in a cover crop, then the next year they put in a grazing cover crop, graze the hell out of it, and then they'd plant their grasses for whatever the mix was. They were doing a native seeding mix. So they'd plant their grasses and then they'd come back, allow that to establish all year, come back in the spring and interseed the forbs once they, well, it wouldn't necessarily be the next spring. It would be when they felt the grasses were established enough that they could protect the forb seeds going in. And it's like, and so instead of doing all this seed all at once, and the reasoning they did behind it makes sense to me. It's, we're doing, I mean, in that particular area, it's wheat and oats on wheat and oats. So, you know, you turn your land into a junkie for wheat and oats and all the fertilizer and chemicals on it. And they were essentially doing the wean off process. And then they were putting all this abundance and diversity in, and they had pretty good success of it. I guess that the comment I have, and then I'll let you talk on it, is you know, one of the things out here where we have all this cropland is we have, you know, we've deteriorated the soil and the soil microbiology so much, and we've made them so dependent on these chemicals that I personally, now that I'm in like Laverne, Minnesota, Southwest Minnesota, the corn country capital, right? I think that 3-year establishment period is a ridiculous joke because we have 25 years of them just applying more fertilizer and more chemicals and more treated seed and more everything out there that we're essentially, we're trying to flesh out a skeleton by year 3, and we probably only have skin on it.
Well, I think you ask a pretty complex question. Before I kind of get into the Montana thing, I want to be also clear about one thing. What we're presenting here is a series of trials that we just try to do something different. I would also say this group of people, I could have put together an amazing presentation on success, on other more typical trials, okay? So we have to be careful here not to take too much away from this webinar to say, oh, you know, what does or doesn't work. We have a pretty damn good idea, pretty darn good idea of things that do work, as well as we have occurrences of failure that we really can't always necessarily pinpoint. We've talked about drought, we've talked about chemical carryover, we talked about planting season and some of these unknowns. So let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater on this thing. On the Montana question, I think it's super intriguing, and there's probably real merit to what they're doing. The question I would ask is, what are they comparing it to? Sometimes we think we have success or failure because we don't have anything to compare it to. I think here, if I could kind of speak for the group, I would say that we know pretty well in eastern South Dakota that if you go in with native grasses and you over apply those native grasses, they will dominate that stand and you'll have a difficult time getting anything else, even native forbs, to really establish. So I think it's always intriguing, and this isn't the first time I've heard this, is put your grasses in first and then let them get established and then put your forbs in. In reality, I would argue that that should be flipped. And others, I think others have much to add to that, to the richness of that conversation about personal experience and trials on flipping that script a little bit, going heavy on forbs and less on grasses. The Fish and Wildlife Service, you know, through some work with Dr. Nordland, they've got this other complete trial like Kyle Kelsey's been doing, where they call it spiking, where they just go incredibly heavy with forbs and suppress weed pressure that way. So there's a lot of other things going on out there in the restoration world that I simply just, you know, didn't have time or ability to address here today. So maybe we're looking at a series of these things where we really get all of this out there. And Patrick, I think it'd be great to hear more of what the problem they were trying to solve, and how well did it work, you know, out of Montana. Maybe we could learn something, you know.
You have my number.
And
Well,
with
sign
that
up for,
being, with that being said, Pete always likes challenging questions and likes to have really good discussions on that. So any of these topics, so feel free to reach out to you, right, Pete? He'll definitely
yeah, I
entertain questions.
can't promise answers, just intriguing questions. You know, the driver here is to try to simplify this on private land, right? Like, I mean, honestly, that's really what we're trying to, that's why we're playing around with all this stuff.
Right. Well, the questions have kind of slowed down, Pete, on the chat, and I don't see anyone else with their hand raised. Do you have any closing thoughts, or?
I just want to thank everybody for taking the time. You know, that's quite a chunk of time out of the day on a Thursday, and you know, I hope we fulfilled what we intended to do here, is get these questions out there, share what we learned. Certainly do not look to me as an expert on these questions. I think if I'm anything, I'm an expert at asking more questions, maybe. You know, like so we're going to continue to play with this stuff and stay tuned. But also I encourage everyone else to share. None of this stuff is valuable unless we get it out there. Like, we might have even created more confusion in the landscape, but at least we're talking about it, right? And that's what I encourage everybody to do. I think we have a tremendous amount of talented, smart people out there, and we're just not necessarily always taking the time to connect these dots. So.
And it's kind of fun to try this stuff on a small scale and have many successes and many disasters, right, Pete? So
Yeah,
when
exactly.
we're out visiting with landowners, that we're giving them the best guidance that we know, and trying to follow what we have in writing, and just doing the best job that we can so they have a successful seeding, and it's not a disaster, and they're not fighting it for years to come, and all those things. But
yep, and I just want to thank NRCS for funding this work. Thank all the partners that have contributed across the board. I can't even begin to thank all of the people that have, you know, this is, like I said, this is not a one person outfit by any means. So I'm just the one that happens to handle the data. But
perfect. Last call for questions. Not seeing or hearing anything, Pete. Well, thank you very much for your time today, Pete. Very interesting information.
All right.
Have a good day, everyone.